Okay. Ah, you can tell when it's time to talk because the door's shut. Okay. Well, thank you for coming to almost the last one. And then we've got the unconference. Who's coming to the unconference? Okay. There's something wrong with your hands. They're not standing up. If you've never done an unconference before, I believe me, it's fun. And you get an enormous amount of satisfaction being part of one. It's great. Really is great fun. Right. So, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about this thing. I've taken off the word easy because I realized obviously there's a difference between you when you submit to a conference and when you actually get to present it. And I was like, easy's coming off because there is an easy bit, which I'm going to touch on. But actually, there's another session that we have tomorrow that might help add some of the easy to this. Right, so my name is Steve Poole. I work for Sonatype. I'm the director of the Developer Advocacy Group. So I'll put the name up again. And who knows Sonatype? Oh gosh, look at this. Normally people go, oh, don't know. And I go, yeah, we're the people who do this, Maven Central. And then people go, Maven Central. Right, and this is going to be important. We're going to talk a little bit about what's happening there. And then I go, also, we do all other stuff like Nexus and things. And people go, I know who you are. So having got that out of the way, we want to talk about this thing. So I will fess up and say Log4Shell is my fault. Okay. And I own up to everything because the 9th of December, one of my security researchers, who was always very good at giving wonderful vulnerabilities and things, and they're in the Node space and the Python space and wherever. And I went, have you not got a Java one we could talk about? And the day later, we get Log4j. So I take it everybody has heard of Log4j. Yes? Yes. And of course, that wonderful thing, which is the most dangerous, widespread vulnerability that we've ever had. It just across everything else. Okay. And many people around Christmas time were affected. So I want to know, how many people here had direct experience in trying to fix a Log4Shell problem? A couple of you. Oh, no, more than that. Yeah. Okay. Normally people will go, I don't want to talk about it. I just don't want to talk about it. Right. Okay. So the first question I have for you is everything safe now? Are you all done? Everybody's comfortable that you've fixed it and there is nothing else to do. Yeah? Okay. Well, so Sonatype. We run Maven Central. One of the things that we can do is keep track of what gets downloaded. And guess what? We have a dashboard for it. And this is today's dashboard. So since whatever it was, December, 200 million-ish downloads of vulnerable versions of Log4j. So those versions that you patched, that you got rid of, there's still 31% of the downloads for Log4j are for vulnerable versions. Okay? Just think about that. And this is a color map. So red is where all they download is the bad ones, and greenish is where they download the things. So you can see pretty much worldwide, apart from Iceland, Greenland and some weird places in India, where in Africa we don't have the data, it's pretty prevalent, okay? So when you look at this data in more detail, you see a few patterns. So this is that long thing that you saw. And this is the beginning, the middle, and the end. So here we are at the beginning. You can see, so the red is the really bad one, but there are others in there as well. And you can see there's a sudden, we got rid of stuff. This is you guys patching. Okay, chunk. And you put a lot of effort into it and you patched it. And then we stayed there. So you can see, the bad versions are these ones at the top. And occasionally a new one will come, a new version will come in, but pretty much it bubble, right? So we're still not very good at this. And in fact, if you think about it, 31%, so that means we're pretty much all Java developers, 31% of the people at DevOps UK probably think they're safe, but in fact aren't. So this is where I want to go, because I want to talk about why we're in this state. What is it that happened, and how we can fix it? There's all bits and pieces like this, so there's a lot of stuff going on as we unpack it. But this is it, right? Much as we think we are safe, we're not, and we're going to have a look at that. So, the first part of this talk is about what's going on, and how do we get there. Okay, so when you think about why would this be the case, why is it that 31% of downloads are for the wrong version, or a vulnerable version? Okay, well, it's possible that a few of those people are downloading deliberately, right? It's not impossible to imagine that there's somebody who's writing a scanning tool or a testing tool and needs a known version of a vulnerable version, right? Or as we keep seeing, people, the bad guys, are still exploiting, because 31% are still using bad versions. And it continues now. And they're getting more and more sophisticated, these attacks. So we know that there are probably some bad guys out there who are contributing to that number, but that's unlikely to be the big thing, is it? That's just going to be noise. Okay. So the first lesson that I'd leave you with is there's always going to be bad software around. So you saw those charts. It says there are all these layers. And you may say, well, you run Maven Central. Why can't you get rid of all the old vulnerable versions, right? Well, the simple reason is that, for what I just said, there are good reasons why vulnerable software may sit in a repository. And one of those may be that somebody needs to test it, or it's got particular environmental configurations that means it's not dangerous. There's all sorts of reasons why it stay there. But you as a developer have to understand there are always going to be lots of these things out there, and you have to deal with that, right? And we'll take down malware, right? So the difference is malware is literally that. Malware is bad code. Vulnerabilities aren't bad code. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses that can be exploited. Malware is a payload of code that will do bad things, right? So we're always taking down malware. Cyanotype is way up there in terms of taking down bad malware. We've got loads of stuff you can go see in the Python space and the Node space, because the bad guys are always adding malware to those things because it's easy, right? But in the Java space, it's much harder to do. And even if you could get some bad code in, it can't run unless somebody triggers it. Whereas lots of this malware stuff, once it gets, if you like, Python or Node, you can run code when you install things. So there's lots of reasons why you get a lot more in that space than in Java space, right? But the important bit to understand is that there's always going to be something up there that's vulnerable. And even stuff that's up there now that we don't know isn't classed as vulnerable. It may be vulnerable tomorrow, right? So you've got to deal with, when you're understanding about fixing this, is that there is always going to be a constant supply of vulnerabilities. And the code you downloaded yesterday, which everybody said was great, today may have big vulnerabilities in it, right? So there's the first one. Now, what else can you imagine would make you go, yeah, so what? Okay. Well, the obvious answer is, the other one is, they don't care, right? They don't care that they're downloading one of these bad pieces of vulnerable piece of code, right? Because they may go, yeah, we'll get around to fixing it. It's been 2 years. It's okay. We'll carry on, right? It may be, and this happens a lot, and probably not so much in Log4Shell space because it's been so visible, but quite often people don't understand how to assess the threat. And so CVEs, which is the moniker which we use to label these things, which you can go search for, they have scores, right? And I'll talk about this in a sec, right? So you get those. So you get a lack of urgency. You get not understanding that it's important, that I've looked at that CVE and realized that it's something we should deal with. And then the other one, the just perennial one, is not quite understanding why it's a problem in the first place. So let's unpack some of those things. So CVEs. So as a developer, it is well worth your while to start to take notice at how these scoring systems work. Because as we'll see, this is going to continue and continue and continue, and it's going to get the numbers that we're going to see coming through for various reasons are going to go through the roof. So you're going to get involved in making assessments, right? Because much as you might have an AppSec team that goes, oh, we've got some filter, at some point somebody will say to you, there's this thing, it's a big problem, should we fix it? And the first thing that you have to get your head around is, how does this work? So there's two things here. So this is, I think this is the CVS score for the Log4Shell. But you can see from this little distribution box at the top that the scoring is nothing to 10. And you can see for some reason there's people don't like to do like 8 or 9. It's like it's a small problem or it's a big problem. But you can see this is current, I don't know how that is, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these things out there, right? And they're all usually fairly important, but you've still got to get through them because of the way the scoring deals with 3-4 things. So there's a base score, which is the one that tells you intrinsically how bad this is. And that's why, you know, when you hit 10 on your base score, then it's like, well, you've hit the top band, you've hit the top number, that's it. This is a really bad thing. And that's going to measure how easy it is to exploit, how prevalent it's going to be. It's just, you know, a 10 is you've opened the door for the bad guys, and probably for every bad guy going. And then there are a couple of other things, which is where you have to start paying attention, because sometimes that scoring changes over time because more is discovered. So you have to ask yourself, how does this work? Who's involved in assessing this? Well, there's groups of people. There are the people who run the system who make some assessments, but then there's also the people who have the problem to fix it. And they have to make some assessments and score it because we're trying to give you the best information we can. So that means that it might start off with a low score, but over time, it might change because somebody realizes that there's some environment where the number should go up. And then the environmental piece of this is which is like the constraints. Like, yeah, this is only a problem if you're running Windows XP, right? So certainly Log4Shell, if we had an environmental constraint for Log4Shell, you might make it's a really bad worldwide problem to, okay, only people who've got running Minecraft. You know, whatever it is. So you have to look at these. And in terms of fairly easy things to do is to get your head around the scoring system. It's not complicated. It's very easy to get what they test for. And then when these things come up, you can look at it and go, yeah, okay, it looks really bad, but we don't have that environment. Okay. The reason you have to do this is because, as I said, the quantity of these things is turning up. And the amount of time that you have to assess is becoming zero, right? So it used to be, this is a measure of how long from an exploit being published to it being exploited. Now, Log4Shell, Log4j is a weird one because Log4j, the vulnerability has been out for years. It wasn't until somebody figured out that it was a vulnerability, but the latent vulnerability had been out for years. But it used to be way back in 2006, you had 45 days. Somebody would say, we found a vulnerability, here's the patch, you have a month to apply it. You know, and you can imagine a lot of that is because of the network things weren't joined together. But over time, this has gone down. And Log4j took us to the point where we went, really, we don't have a 0-day anything, right? What we have is it's closed. And it's closed for some pretty horrible reasons. So now you can expect that when you hear about a vulnerability and there is a patch, there is no time to patch. It is being exploited. And the more prevalent it is, the more valuable it is, the more likely that they're going to make exploiting it. And it gets worse because the publication of this, letting you know, is being suppressed. Because this is a way into your systems. And we're moving away from just cybercrime reasons to more state-driven things, which is a bigger topic. But basically, we're now moving to situations where something like Log4Shell, if it was brand new and it was discovered by a researcher in the wrong place, or it was discovered by a researcher who has no ethics, can make millions of dollars not promoting it because it becomes a weapon, right? So we have that. China has for some time required that nothing can be published without permission because for the same reasons. So we have active states who are trying to suppress this. So that means to you that when a CVE like Log4Shell turns up, there's no debate. It's already been exploited. You may already be hacked, right? Because the more useful that vulnerability is, the more severe it is, the more useful it is for the bad actors and now modern states, okay? So you have to understand that Log4Shells are going to be rare, but when they do turn up, they are very likely to have been exploited already, okay? So lesson 2 of all this is this idea of it being exploit first. Right? You've got to get that in your head. So that's where we're heading, right? So when you talk about that, you have to say that the first obvious thing you've got to fix off is you've got to get your situation sorted so that when somebody says to you, this thing has turned up, you've got to be able to go, I can assess it. I can make an immediate decision about whether this needs to be fixed. And obviously AppSec people, the rest of your company will be involved, but it will still come down to, hey, developer, do we have to do this? Because it is expensive, right? And it means you have to have processes that can apply and deliver. Which is why one of the reasons I've taken the easy off this is because some of this isn't, hey, it's your problem, but it is, you can see where this is going, right? The ones that get this right, and there are many people out there who already fix this, get remediation scores down from the remediation times from being aware to having fixed down to, small numbers, right? But it still comes back to ultimately developers have to get involved, and it is a skill that unfortunately is one of these things you have to learn. So if you want to know more, you go to NIST. There are loads of stuff. You can Google for CVEs and you'll find all the information you need. But that's the new reality. Okay. Yeah, one more thing. It's going to get worse because not only do we have human beings trying to get in and find vulnerabilities and do all that research, we have AI doing it now, as you'd expect. Again, you can go Google for this. There's some scary stuff out there about how this is happening, as you can imagine. I mean, I'm sure most of you probably had to go with ChatGPT or something like that and been amused and appalled, right? And these things get weaponized because they become ways in. Now, the good news is it's also working all the way around. Security companies are also trying to use these as ways to find them and fix them. But you can see the ratchet goes up, it gets bigger. Okay, so what else can we talk about? What other reasons would you have for not patching? Okay, well, the other one that comes up is people go, well, there's no patch. And you go, well, I've got to fix Log4j. And you go, yeah. Well, this is your app, and you depend on stuff. You have direct dependencies, which are the ones that you care about, the ones that you can influence. And then you have transitive dependencies, which are the dependencies of your dependencies and your dependencies. Okay? And on average, if you've not seen this, you probably have 150 odd dependencies for your application. That's about average. Okay, so that means that if you're looking at this naively, you're going, Log4Shell's come out, I have a Log4j problem, and I need to fix it. But it's down there. So I need to get the person fixed who's using it to fix it. Or I need to keep so that's a new version. Then I need to guide the people above those to fix it, and so on. So you end up with this chain where you're sitting there going, I'm sitting there and waiting for somebody who's waiting for somebody who's waiting for somebody who's waiting for somebody. And that, unfortunately, is often the case. That you have that situation, you go, I'm waiting, which we'll talk about that in a second, different. The thing is, and again, some things you can go play is, it's actually really easy, if you're using Maven or Gradle or any of these tools, to add in and override the dependency of one of these transitive dependencies. You don't have to wait for them to update it. You can force the version up. It's really easy to do. I mean, I've got a couple of things you can go Google for them, but they're ever easy to do. Now, of course, you run a risk, because if you update, then you might break something. But the fact is, as a developer, you can do that and you can try it out. So you can say, Log4Shell comes out, Log4j comes out, we have a problem. What can we do? Then you override it in your build process and you see what happens. You can do it as a developer, and then if it works, you can fix it. And there's enough subtleties and configurations in there if you go read it. You can manage that quite well. Right? And it is surprising how many developers don't know that or actually balk at the idea of doing that because of some worry that things will go wrong. And of course, if it's Log4Shell, it's like, yeah, we just have to do that. Right. My experience of talking to people who do this is they've invested in all the automation systems, because they're going, you have to be able to do this in a mechanical mechanism. If every time you do this you need to put some human being involved, then that's bad, because this process is key to allowing you to keep safe, because once you get into the hang of doing this, you can apply this to any situation where you're waiting on somebody to give you a fix. You don't have you obviously take the risk, but you get the safety fast. Right. Now there is a variation on this, which is some assumption that the person way down the tree of all this stuff actually cares and actually wants you, actually cares about fixing it. And you'd be surprised how often, and Log4Shell was one of those where we had instances of open source projects not understanding and not being willing to make the changes because they felt it wasn't their problem. So again, what do you do? What are you going to do when you know you need to make a fix, but you can't get the people to pay attention? Right. Well, this sort of, you can step back and look at this and go, well, actually, the change for you as a developer is to stop being reactive, which is what we are here. I have a problem. What do I do about it? Is to step back a bit and go, how did I get here in the first place? What choice drove me to using a project where the people who I'm depending on can't be depended on? Right. And that comes to a little bit about Maven Central, but actually the new way of thinking that you've got to start getting your head into is you've got to start thinking more about why you chose something in the first place. So again, a new skill to start thinking about, and you already know how to do this because you will have made these sort of decisions yourself. But this is, Common CSV, I just picked one. This is from Maven Central. There's a little blocks which says Sternotype safety rating. So Sternotype, and I've got some more details, but Sternotype is working with others. We're trying to figure out, can we give you the information you need to make decisions about the capabilities of that dependency, of the people who are producing, not the tech, not the quality of the tech, but whether the people can actually deliver what you need, right? Now, obviously, it's open source, so there's no promises they will, but you want to be able to feel that if things were going bad, that they have a security process, that they understand about these things. Because obviously the more they understand, the less likely they are to generate vulnerabilities. So that's on there. It's not on everything, because it's experimental. There it is again. We are working with Linux Foundation, CNCF, OpenSSF, all those people, because everybody is looking at this problem, and I'll touch about that in a minute. But the idea is can we quantify what makes basically good software engineering practices? And then can we apply that to open source projects to see whether or not they are people who you can depend on? There's, where is it on this one? No, there's the CNCF of, CLO Monitor, for instance, that one on the back there. That's already being applied to CNCF projects. They're being told. It's really basic stuff, things like, do you have a security MD file? Do you have a vulnerability process? Okay, and these things are really important. And I'll explain why they're really important. But what can you do as a developer? Well, you can start to be involved in understanding this is happening and start looking for it, because it's not going to just be on Sonatype. It's going to, Maven Central, it's going to turn up in different places. You're going to see this. So when you decide you're going to select an open source project, a dependency, you don't sit there and go, does it give me features? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is you use your nose, and you start looking at that open source project, and you start thinking about the choices that are being demonstrated. Now, you know this subjectively. So you're going to pick something, you've got some new feature you want to use, you go, this is great, some package for it, you go to it, the release hasn't been released the last release was some time ago. You maybe go to the GitHub repo, and it says, last updated 7 years ago. And you go, not good, right? It's not bad, but you know that it's not active. And so if there was a vulnerability, you might go, don't want to do this. So you're looking to the beginning of the choices rather than be reactive and starting to look for this information, right? So that's what's happening. So it's not just Sonatype. You're going to see these tools ending up everywhere. They're tools you're going to become involved in. For now, you'll see that on Maven Central. But one of the things that we've got is this bomb doctor report, which we'll talk a bit more about that. But specifically, one of the ideas is, I talked to you about transitive dependencies. You saw that little picture. How do you know what your dependencies are? Because the chances are the only time you see it is you do Maven install or something, and you get a long list as it downloads from wherever repo you're going from. And that's probably the most you ever see of it. And that's good. But actually, we have this thing called Bomb Doctor, which connects, some of the projects are connected. You can go bring up your own project. And again, it's all part of this exploring the data that we can provide you. And Bomb Doctor is more substantial, because the idea of Bomb Doctor is not only can you visualize your dependencies, it also gives you some scoring information based on things we're thinking of and what we're getting from the Linux Foundation. And it's also intended to give you the opportunities to make some decisions. I've got a better picture here. So it's a graphical thing. You can wander all over this thing, and you can pick these. You can say, what happens if I upgrade this project? I said about being able to do, override these things. The idea is that you'll be able to go through this one. It will tell you where the bad guys are, which of these is the worst, right? And because with Java, we can spot breaking changes, at least at API level. That's also in there as well. So actually, we can give you more help in terms of selecting. So you can try things out, go, if I pick this and I pick this and I upgrade this to this version, will it work? And it may say yes or no. And ultimately, not quite yet, the other thing you'll get, you'll download those changes that you can apply to your POM, right? So we're trying to give you that information straight out of Maven Central, okay? Right. So, next one. The server is not externally accessible. Well, this is a very Log4Shell thing. I had this all the time I was talking to people, because people don't understand the problem. Right? People read things and they listen to things, and nobody understood. They were just panicking. And so you get this. This is this environmental thing where people go, I'm safe. I have a firewall. That's the usual one, or not internet facing. That's the other one. When you look at your systems and you look at these vulnerabilities that come up, there will be components that will tell you whether it's a network effect or not. But obviously, you all know from Log4Shell that it was about the data, and that it didn't matter whether your system was network internet facing or not, as long as it connected to a system that's got data in it, and if that data came from the external world, then your system could be corrupted. Right. The thing to think about is that if anybody says to you it's not externally accessible, that doesn't mean anything, because your network's not safe either. So if you're sitting there thinking, we have a great firewall, then think again, because more than many examples of developers just downloading something and compromising systems, right? So the takeaway from this is you have to ignore that thought. Don't go, we could be safe. Don't go, we have some defenses, because they probably don't work. And you don't have time. So the thing that you have to start looking at is the CVSS score. Right? You're going to get involved in this. It's going to come up, and you're going to have to make a decision. And you have got to read the data, look at it, and if you make those sorts of assumptions, like everything's safe because we have a firewall, that's the wrong way. You look at the CV score, it tells you how bad it's going to be in your environment, right? And patch as automatically as possible. The corollary to this, though, unfortunately, is that more and more of these are coming down the pipe faster. So you have to automate. You have to look at ways you can assess these as fast as possible, because that's your defense. Your defense is looking at it, making some decisions that it's worth investing some testing time, and then doing it. And obviously, if you could just infinitely do it, that's what you do. But actually, human beings involved, other than what it says in the CVSS score, is going to get you into all sorts of problems. Okay, so some of those are fairly vaguely silly. There's a big one. This is probably the one that bites most of us, is the scanning tools that you use don't necessarily report the vulnerability. Right. The challenge for all of us is we rely on tools. As developers, you rely on tools. You rely on compilers, operating systems. It just does what it does. But scanning tools, unfortunately, vary enormously. And we don't normally get that because, come on, it's a security tool. It's not your problem. It's somebody else's. So, I mean, if you've got an open source project, you may have Dependabot. Great. But Dependabot just does direct dependencies, right? Which is great, but you want something more. So the question you have to start asking yourself is, what makes a good scanning tool, right? And it's complicated. Right. But again, what am I going to ask you? I'm going to ask you to think about this, but I'm also going to ask you to think about how you prove this. So what makes a good scanning tool? Well, what does it scan? Think of all the ways that you can imagine code gets delivered. Is it got a Docker container? Cool. Zip files, jar files, ISOs, NPMs, RPMs. So many ways that code can get delivered to you, and nested and obfuscated and packed and nested and packed. And so there are so many complex ways that code can get delivered to you personally or to the system you're using. And yeah, they may all get unpacked in the end, but often the time it's the scanning the artifact. So is the scanner able to do that? Can it deal with all those things, right? And then when it says scanning, what is it looking for? the very simplest thing we see are the POMs, pom.xml. It's got version numbers in, right? And those version numbers will point to something which in theory will have some more information and we can go on. But that's not good enough because that could be faked, and that's very high level because the bad guys aren't they're not at that level. Bad guys like to be more inventive. And so you'll find them playing around with packages. Maybe they've stolen part of Log4Shell's package and stuck that in a jar file. So if you have a scanning tool that looks at some metadata in the file, jar file, and it says, I'm foo.version 10, but there's a bunch of other code, would your scanning tool find that one out? What about just a spare class? Log4Shell propagated so well because the nasty piece of code, which is in one nice little class, was picked out and put all of it. It got picked out by people for non-nefarious reasons. There are people, oh, it's a really great tool. I can do JNDI remote loading of classes. That's lovely. I'll put that as a packet, as a class file in mine. But also the bad guys did it. And in fact, the bad guys also tried to get it inserted into other people's projects. So will your scanning tool find that? And it can imagine it gets further down. How inventive are you? What about if I take just a method of the bad code, right, and I insert it? What happens if it's a service loader? I've got lots of ways of triggering it. How good is your scanning tool at finding those things? Is it thinking about these? It's like bytecode. It's like, where, how deep, right? Now, the thing is, honestly, you have to write some tests. You have to be creative too. You have to create some environments and go, will my scanning tool find this? Because if your scanning tools don't find these things, then there's no point running them. There's no point having them, right? Because they're not helping, right? I talked about nested, yeah. Now, so that's the tools. How deep can the tools go? Then the next thing is, what's the data like? Where does the data come from that tells you that's a good, useful tool? Because I can have the greatest tool in the world, and if it hasn't got the data to understand about Log4Shell, how would it find it? So the other thing you have to ask yourself is, where does the data come from? How good is it? Who's creating it? How much is it? All that sort of stuff, right? And that's a commercial thing, but you get the point, right? The tools are great. The data is the most important bit. And then things like transitive dependencies. Some of this stuff is really good. These tools are really good at looking at that first level thing that you've used and no further. So it has to be able to go further. It has to be able to deal with the things that your dependencies declare and so on and so on like that. So does it do that? Okay. Right. Now, there are more subtle things like, can it find your internal code in unexpected places? Think about that. How would you're working on the stuff that you work on, and it doesn't go on Maven Central, but what happened if I figured out what your package names were, and I put them up on Maven Central? Which code would run? My version of your code or your version of your code? Right? And depending on where it is, it might be. And it's a classic attack is to find the internal names of your packages and create public versions of them. Because quite often when you're scanning for downloading stuff, you go to public first, right? And remember, it doesn't necessarily have to go find the same jar. It's just got to deliver code. So you may download something, and nested inside there could be some in classes that, in theory, were yours, right? And these things happen, right? And then more subtle types. Yeah, there's some more. So let's just talk about that for a sec. For a very long time, the bad actors would just go looking for these CVEs and mine them to create vulnerabilities. That was the usual way of doing it. Right? That doesn't happen anymore. Well, it does happen, but there are these other things that are happening. This is, again, why we're here. How do we prevent Log4Shell from happening again? You have to be aware of what's going on. So you will hear dependency confusion. You hear type squatting. You'll hear build tool attacks, open source repo attacks. Dependency confusion is not as bad in the Java space as it is in others, but that's very much driven by, can I get a version into the public repo that's a higher number than the real one, so that when you do give me the latest, it goes and finds somebody else's. It's not a Java problem, thankfully, but it does happen in other repo systems. Typo squatting is more prevalent, and that's literally that. You type something, you think about it, you type in something, and you spell it wrong, and you might be lucky, and it may say can't find it. You may be unlucky, and it may already be a version out there that's similar to the one that you wanted, but has been hacked, and they've changed the names of the packages slightly by, just rearrange a couple of characters, and suddenly you're downloading somebody else's code. And you don't see it because it works. Right? They're horrible. These things are becoming more and more automated at the time. And then the other thing that's going on is attacking these open source projects directly. I said about trying to figure out whether these projects have good security hygiene. It's not only about whether you can get the fixes you want, it's also how well prepared are these people to deal with these sorts of challenges. And the build tool attacks, which unfortunately happens a lot because it's easy, is the bad guys get in and they insert some nasty piece of code in the packaging just before it gets put up on GitHub. So when I talk about scanning tools, I'm talking about it in those sorts of contexts as well, where is it going to find things that these guys are inserting in the dependencies that you're relying on? Right? Yeah. Yes, and as I said, your internal packages, unfortunately, again, mostly in outside Java, but that may change, is your code, names that you care about, are ending up on public repos because you use that code first rather than your version because of the way things are set up. Okay, so here are, how many have I got? 3, 4, 5, 7 lessons. But I haven't finished. There's more to talk about. Harmful software is always going to be existing in repos, right? That's a factor of life. It's always been like that. But it's going to be more active because the bad guys are trying to put bad code in there. So you have to be more considered about the choices you make, okay? It's going to be exploit first. And zero time, because if it's a bad thing, you could be being exploited now. Right? When you pick dependencies, don't pick them for the feature alone, pick them for these other characteristics. What's their security posture? Because if you can pick that now, when you do the next time you pick something, even if you're just looking at, bumping a version, now is the time to have a look at that project and go, do I feel that they are a safe pair of hands? And if they're not, you can say, okay, well, maybe won't use them, right? Maybe we'll go do something else. Maybe you write a little bit of code rather than using somebody else's dependencies, right? There's a whole bunch of tools turning up to help you do this, but it's early days, but it is being driven. I may have time to tell you about why it's being driven, but there is a lot happening, right? And lastly, you have to check your assumptions about your scanning tools. Go prove they do what you think, right? I said none of this was easy. Right, a few more bits and pieces. There are other things you can do, right? Luckily, pretty much any time a vulnerability gets announced, there is a fix, which is a good thing. So a lot of the time, if the problem isn't with them, it's with you. It's how quickly can you get your things fixed. And the challenge with all this stuff like scanning tools is, because you've got to know how good your scanning tools are, is there any other way we can do this without using scanning tools? Because that would be nice to get away from wondering whether your tool's as good as somebody else's because you don't know, which is why you'll have heard of this thing. Software bill of materials, SBOMs, yes? No? Well, yeah, okay. So software bill of materials, there's a couple of standards out there, but the idea is rather than scan for what's in a thing that you've got downloaded, is to have that thing publish a bill of materials that you can rely on. And you're going to see this a lot more coming out. That bomb doctor thing I showed you uses S-bombs. So you can actually generate an S-bomb for your project now and go see what the situation is. But this is the new way. We are moving towards less of scanning tools to work out what you've got and more of having the components deliver detailed information about what they depend on in a signed, controlled manner. There's a whole bunch of tools. We're doing a talk tomorrow about SBOM vulnerability scanners. If you want to know more about it, there's a lot of them to cover. There's all sorts of stuff out there. So if you're interested, like you say, go have a look at those sorts of tools, because SBOMs are definitely the next set of tools to get you around. If you're really lucky, they will do away with your scanners eventually, and we'll move into a brighter world. So that was SBOMs. And the thing is, if you don't get your act together and do it now, this guy and some nice people over in the EU are going to make you do it. Because eventually, the idea is that those of us involved in the software business, where we provide software to other people, whether it's a service or as a download, are going to be held accountable for that software. So you imagine if you bought a car and the airbags didn't work and the supplier knew that when they shipped it to you, they would be criminally liable. The EU want to do that to software. So a lot of what I said is all turning into automation and evidence and all these things. It's just turning into, this is what life's going to be anyway. So maybe it's a good idea just to, get ahead of the game. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you could go look at. And the very last thing I'll leave you with is, it turns out the one thing that we've noticed, because we're scanning all these projects, the one thing that you can use when you go look at open source projects to see whether they are likely to be safe or not is whether or not they do code review. These are all aspects of things that were measured against their vulnerability background. And the number one thing was these guys do code review, which if you think about it means they care about their code. And that's probably the biggest thing, right? And I think, yeah. And it just turns out after all this stuff, that if you start doing these things, you start automating them, you start worrying about security, and you start looking at your dependencies with that level of software engineering, and you put these things together, it also turns out, based on all the data we've got, that it will make your team super productive too, because you're bringing back into play those software engineering techniques that many of us are lost. And what we're seeing is the people who are dealing with security and dealing with productivity, automation, and this sort of good software insight is making them high performers. Thank you. Sorry, I've got 3 minutes, but thank you anyway. Any questions? Okay, well, I've got a booth, so if you want to see me later this conference, I'm there. We have a talk tomorrow. But other than that, thank you for listening.